All right, welcome to episode 49 of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest, Massimo Pigliucci. He is the KD Irani Professor of Philosophy at the City College of New York. He's author of How to Be a Stoic, Ancient Wisdom for Modern Living, Handbook for New Stoics, How to Thrive in a World Out of Your Control, co-authored with Gregory Lopez, and How to Live a Good Life, a guide to choosing your personal philosophy, co-edited with Skye, Cleary, and Dan Kaufman. Welcome, Massimo.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on, Massimo. And so, of course, today we're going to talk about how to live a good life, and in particular, your chapter on Stoicism and how to live a good life.
Right.
And so my first question is going to be, so who were the ancient Stoics, and what sort of wisdom did they have to provide us with?
Well, the ancient Stoics were a group of Hellenistic philosophers. The Hellenistic period goes roughly from the death of Alexander the Great and the collapse of the Macedonian Empire to the beginning of the Roman Empire. And it was a period of turmoil in the Mediterranean world. I mean, things were happening very fast, and people felt like they had no control over sort of the big events in life. And so that period brought about a flourishing of a number of philosophies, not just Stoicism, but also Epicureanism, Aristotelianism, Cyrenaism, skepticism. There's a bunch of them. And it's probably not by chance, because that kind of turmoil and feeling like things are not only changing rapidly, but the changes are outside your control, typically sort of helps or fostering the development of philosophies. This has happened in other times and periods and places in the history of humanity. In fact, 200 years earlier, it had happened in India for Buddhism, and about at the same time in China in the case of Confucianism. So those also were periods of major turmoil locally, and as a result, you get the origin of these philosophies. Now, Stoicism in particular was studied by a merchant, a Phoenician merchant, a guy named Zeno of Citium, around 300 BCE. And Zeno had lost everything he had in a shipwreck, and he made it alive to Athens. And of course, when you're shipwrecked and you lost everything, the first thing you do is what? You go to a bookstore, which is what Zeno did. Yeah. And naturally, he started reading Xenophon's Memorabilia, which is a book about the life of Socrates, which we still have. It survived to modern times. And while he was reading that book, he turned to the bookseller and he said, where can I find me a guy like this, meaning a philosopher? And the bookseller turned around and said, well, there's one walking right here outside the door right now, and follow that guy, and I'm sure he's a philosopher. And that guy turned out to be Cradle of Thebes, who was a Cynic philosopher. That's how Zeno got started. He actually studied philosophy with a number of teachers, and then at some point he felt confident enough to start teaching on his own. And he started teaching in the middle of the market, basically, right outside of the Agora, which is the main market main market in Athens, in a place called the Stoa Poikile, which means painted porch. And that's why the name Stoics.
Interesting.
Because it comes from the Stoa. And the basic teaching is that of Stoicism is that we should live according to nature, by which the Stoics mean that we should take seriously the most important, most distinctive parts of aspects of human nature. And for them, there are two of these most distinctive aspects. One, that we are capable of reason, and two, that we are highly social animals. We thrive only in a social group. So it followed for the Stoics that a good human life is a life where you apply your mind to improve social living. And so that's the fundamental notion of Stoicism. Then I'm sure we're going to talk about how they actually cash that in practice, and and how do you actually do that. But that's the basic idea.
And so, what would the four cardinal virtues of Stoicism then be?
So that's one way to actually implement this notion of living according to nature. In practice, one way to practice Stoicism, to actually implement Stoicism in your life, is to keep in mind these four fundamental or cardinal virtues and use them essentially as a moral compass, as a way to navigate your life. So you should never do anything, according to the Stoics, that the four virtues wouldn't agree on have you do it. So the four virtues are practical wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. The one that often creates problems for people is practical wisdom. So let me start with that. First of all, it's an unwieldy translation in English. The original Greek term is phronesis. And it just means the knowledge of what is good and bad for you. Okay, what is truly good and bad for you. Now, we all grow up with our parents, our peers, television, and so on and so forth, telling us that things that are good for us include, money, women or men, depending on your preferences, fame, that sort of stuff, career, and so on and so forth. For the Stoics, on the other hand, all of those things may be preferred or dispreferred, but they're not the main thing that you should focus on. The only thing that is truly good for you is your own moral character. Right? So your own good judgments. And so basically, the practice of the implementation of practical wisdom in your life just means that anytime you're about to do something, you should ask yourself, is this good for my character or not? Is it going to improve my character or is it going to undermine my character? I'll give you an example in a minute. The second virtue, cardinal virtue, is courage, by which they didn't mean just courage to go into battle or to face physical danger, although it could be that. But mostly it's moral courage. It's the courage to do the right thing. Right? And then the third virtue, which is closely related to courage, is justice, meaning that you really need to do the right thing. You need to know what the right thing to do. As the right thing when it comes to interacting with others, right? So practical wisdom is the right thing for you, and justice is the right thing when it comes to others, because after all, we do live in a society. So there's a distinction there, right? And the distinction is that, of course, as I just said, what's good for you is really the improvement of your own moral character. Well, that's not the same thing that is good for others, meaning that you cannot improve other people's character. That's up to them, right? But what you can do is to treat them fairly, to treat them as, with integrity, and generosity, all sorts of stuff. And then the fourth virtue is temperance. Temperance is often understood as doing things in small doses, but in fact, it means doing things in right doses, in the right amount, neither too much nor too little. So let me give you a standard example. Let's say that I'm at work and I see my boss that is harassing one of my coworkers. Okay? Well, should I intervene? Now let's see how the four virtues will answer. First, in terms of practical wisdom, yes, it's good for my character to intervene, and no, it's not good for my character not to intervene, right? Because not doing the right thing undermines my own character. So in my own terms, in terms of what is good for me, it's actually a good thing to intervene. Second, does it require courage? Yes, it requires courage because, after all, it's my boss. So I could face retaliation. I could be fired, or I could be getting on his, the wrong side of things, and so on and so forth. So it requires courage. Is it just? Well, hell yes, because if I were the one being harassed, I would want somebody to step in and help me out. Right?
Absolutely.
And so I just by stepping in, I'm just treating other people the way in which I would like them to treat me. And what about temperance? Well, temperance tells me that I should do it in the right measure. So I shouldn't go either too little. That would be like, muttering under my breath that there's something wrong, but without my boss actually listening to me, hearing me. Well, that's not enough because that doesn't do anything. But at the same time, you also don't want to jump on your boss and punch him on the nose, because that seems like a little too much of a reaction considering what the situation is. Right. And so temperance tells you that you should probably say calmly and politely to your boss something along the lines of, hey, this is not acceptable. Maybe we can come up with some kind of understanding. So that's a classic example of how you actually practice the Stoicism. Everything that you do, you should ask yourself, well, is this practically wise or phronetic, if you want to use the Greek word? Is it courageous? Is it just? And is it temperate? And if the answer is no to any of those questions, don't do it.
Yeah. I love that so much. And so I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist, and so I try my best to implement Stoic practices and sort of Stoic teachings. And so outside of existential philosophy, and shout out to Skye, so Stoicism has definitely been one of the most empowering philosophies I've ever encountered. And what I love about it is that, a lot of what we go through is that, the sort of, as they say, we kind of encounter the vicissitudes of life in the world, and a lot of it we can't control. And what's so beautiful about Stoicism and focusing on character and the person you actually are is that that's always going to be, or for the most part, depending on obviously mental illness and obviously things outside of your control.
Right.
Right. So it's always going to be a part of your life, and it's always going to be a part of something that you can actually sort of mold on your own, with obviously help, but it's for the most part virtually within your control. And so what I found to be in my own practice is that Stoicism and Stoic principles have given people the ability to look at themselves and look at their lives in a much more hopeful and, like, let's say, much more empowering way. And is that kind of what brought you to the Stoicism? Sort of feeling that, like, this was a philosophy that made you feel like you were more in control than you were before?
Yes, I got to Stoicism after a search for several years that started out with a midlife crisis, not surprisingly. Nothing particularly terrible happened, but the kind of things that make you question your situation. So on the one hand, I went through a divorce, and my father died, and I changed jobs, and I moved to another place. All of those things happened within a span of a few months. And now one of those things is normally problematic enough that you need to sort of slow down and figure out what you want to do. Having all four of them happen basically simultaneously kind of, it's like, wow, okay, now what kind of thing, right? Now, that was also the time that I was actually beginning to study seriously at a graduate level philosophy, because my first career was as a scientist. I was an evolutionary biologist for a long time. And I had just gone, through graduate school in philosophy. And even though in graduate school you study, technical philosophy, obviously, but you also have to take, some of the basics. So I took a course on Plato, I took a course on ethics, and so at some point it struck me as like, well, maybe philosophy is going to be the where you want to go in terms of sort of reorienting yourself and your life, and it struck me immediately that the answer or a good framework was going to come from virtue ethics. Right. So virtue ethics is this broad approach that was developed by the ancient Greeks and Romans, and that focuses not on what is right or wrong in general, but how to improve your character, how to live your life, really. And so I started approaching virtue ethics, and the first stop was, of course, Aristotle. And the problem with Aristotle, as far as I was concerned, is that the guy was a little bit on the elitist side of things. Not surprisingly, since his father was a doctor at the court of the king of Macedon. So and he was a tutor of Alexander the Great. Right. So he was an aristocrat. But basically, what he said was, virtue is absolutely important. Your character is important. But in order to have a eudaimonic life, a life worth living, you also have to have a number of other things. You have to have a little bit of education. A little bit, you have to be healthy. You have to have a little bit of wealth. You have to be good looking. And I said, oh, come on, that's it, done. That's not gonna work. So the second step, the second stop was Epicureanism, and there was a reason for that. For a long time, when I was a kid, I grew up in Rome, and I grew up in the Catholic Church, and then I left the church around age 15-ish or so. And ever since, I consider myself a secular humanist. A lot of secular humanists are inclined toward the philosophy of Epicurus for a number of reasons. First of all, because Epicurus was obviously an atomist in terms of physics. So, his metaphysics was actually very compatible with modern science, or at least an antecedent to modern science. He was not an atheist, but he thought that the God doesn't really give a damn about human beings, and more importantly, that you shouldn't be afraid of dying because there is no afterlife, there is no eternal punishment, nothing like that. So you could see why that sort of attitude would, and he was also big on friendship. So you would see why that kind of attitude actually fits with sort of a secular humanist perspective. The problem with Epicureans, so that's why I approached it. The problem with Epicureans is that Epicureanism is that the fundamental thing in Epicurean, the goal of an Epicurean life, is to minimize pain. In fact, Epicurus actually defined the highest pleasure as lack of pain, particularly emotional pain. Right? Well, the problem with that is that he also immediately said, therefore, you don't want to get involved in society, and especially in politics. Because, because as we all know, that's really painful. Right? And I cannot imagine a meaningful life for me without a social and political involvement of some sort. So I said, well, thanks for participating, but that's not going to happen. So that's where I was at the time, and I I was still thinking that in somewhere in that area, there had to be the answer. And then I got this tweet that said, help us celebrate Stoic Week. Mm-hmm. So the hell is that? Mm-hmm. Who wants to celebrate the Stoics? And why? Mm-hmm. But I was curious, and of course I remembered the Stoics were also a type of virtue ethics, and so I signed up, and the rest is history. Because the first Stoic that I read about, I had read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations when I was in college. Mm-hmm. I had actually translated Seneca when I was in high school because I studied Latin. Wow. But I never actually connected the two. I didn't even think that the two were actually sort of somehow connected. And I had no idea who the hell Epictetus was. Mm-hmm. Because even though he was a major philosopher for most of the last 2 millennia, and up until the 19th century included, in the 20th century, it kind of went into an eclipse, and lots of people sort of forgot about Epictetus. Mm-hmm. And so even in graduate school, I never heard of Epictetus. Graduate school in philosophy, I never heard of Epictetus, right? Mm-hmm. Even though I took a course in ancient Greek philosophy. So it's like, what? Mm-hmm. Who is this guy?
Yeah, and he's often confused with Epicurus.
Sorry, say that again.
He's often confused with Epicurus.
Yes, yeah. That's right. First of all, they all start with AP, whatever. And also, in fact, if you do a search online for images for Epictetus, actually Epicurus comes up a lot, which is why you read a lot of articles that are about Epictetus, but actually accompanied by a picture of Epicurus, which is like, no.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
It's particularly ironic because in one chapter of the Discourses, Epictetus actually has a big diatribe against Epicurus. And he really goes into a rampage about Epicurus and why it's a bad idea to be an Epicurean and so on. So it's kind of ironic that he's often confused with Epicurus today.
Yeah. And so what drew you to the philosophy, to Epictetus?
Well, Epictetus spoke to me for a number of reasons. First of all, because he's no nonsense. Like one of the very first things that I read in the beginning of the Discourses of Epictetus, he says, so fine, we'll have to die, someday, but it appears that this is not the day. On the other hand, I am hungry, and so let's go for lunch. It's like, whoa, okay, I can see that. I also kind of it resonates his bluntness to his students. To some extent his sense of humor and even sarcasm. He actually makes fun of his students. He says at one point in the Discourses also, he says, so I see a bunch of you here are interested in Stoicism, and you understand the theory. You know everything about the virtues and the dichotomy of control, and then you go out and you behave like Aristotelians. It's like, what's the matter with you?
And what did he mean by that?
Yeah, so it's like, why are you wasting my time with this stuff and your time as well? It's like, obviously you don't believe it. You understand it, but you don't believe it because you're not practicing it. So, so those are reasons why Epictetus immediately sort of spoke to me. But then you get in depth into his philosophy and, of course, into other Stoics' philosophy, particularly Seneca. Seneca is the one that we have by far the most material that survived. So we have 124 letters that he wrote to Lucilius, to his friend Lucilius. We have on anger. We have on the happy life. We have a bunch of things from Seneca. So he's by far the most the ancient author of Stoicism, from which we have the most documentation. And once you start delving into the philosophy in depth, it's like, wow, yeah. The more I got into it, the more it made sense. So it had sort of the opposite. It was the opposite experience from Aristotle and Epicurus that superficially looked good, and then when I started looking into the details, no, this is not for me.
Yeah.
And there are ways to practice Stoicism, right? Like, for example, restriction, right? Like maybe fasting or cold exposure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there are several practices in Stoicism. With Greg Lopez, you mentioned, we wrote with my friend Greg. We wrote a book called the Handbook. For New Stoics, and it has 52 exercises. Now, we came up with those exercises. You don't find them directly into the ancient sources, but each exercise is directly inspired by a quote from Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius or Seneca, or even some of the rather lesser-known Stoics, like Musonius Rufus, for instance, who was Epictetus' teacher. But the Stoics clearly practiced. I mean, they did have an emphasis on practice, and even though they might not have practiced in the way we practice 2,000 years later, or certainly they didn't use the same terminology. The notion that Stoicism is a small part of theory and a great part of practice was there from the beginning. Mm-hmm. Now, you just mentioned one of the standard exercises. These are self-deprivation exercises, right? Like fasting, for instance. Mm-hmm. or taking a cold shower or something like that. Now, the point of those exercises is twofold. On the one hand, to remind yourself that you can actually deal with deprivation, being deprived of certain things for a period, right? So you can skip a meal or two, or you don't have to have a hot shower, available, hot water available. You can deal with it. In other words, it's about reminding yourself that you're more resilient than you might think. But it's also a exercise in appreciation of what you normally have and you might not appreciate. There's this wonderful passage in Seneca's letters to Lucilius where he says that he went fasting for a couple of days, and then he says, "You wouldn't believe how good that soup and stale bread tasted." And I went back to eating. I was like, so he was used to pretty fancy meals because he was a senator. He was pretty wealthy man. Mm-hmm. But he says stale bread and soup just was wonderful after you fasted for 2 days. So that's those are the two reasons why you do these exercises. One reason not to do these exercises is to show off to other people. I mean, I've actually seen people that take a cold shower and then they take selfies of themselves and post it on social media. It's like, no, that's not the reason to do it.
Yeah.
You're just trying to show off, which is definitely not good for your character. Showing off is not a good thing for your character. You're certainly undermining, and you're not engaging in practical wisdom in the way you should. So just like in anything, it's especially particularly about in philosophy and specifically in Stoicism, it's all about why you do certain things, not just the things that you do. One of the differences between ancient philosophy and modern philosophy, and one of the reasons I prefer the ancient variety, is that modern philosophies like utilitarianism or Kantian-style deontology and things like that, they tend to be focused on whether an action is right or wrong. Right? The Stoics would never ask that question because actions are not right or wrong in a vacuum. It's always about your intentions. Why are you doing that sort of thing? Right. Virtue is not in the action. Virtue is in the intentions of the agent, right? And so let me give you an example. Let's say, for instance, that you volunteer for the local soup kitchen, and if you ask a Kantian, they will probably say, yeah, that's a good thing to do because you're being helpful to other people. If you ask a utilitarian, they will probably say, yeah, that's a good thing to do because you're increasing total happiness, stuff like that. And a Stoic will say, well, tell me more. Why are you doing this thing? Because if you're doing it in order to actually help other people, because you're actually concerned about other people, then yes, that's a virtuous action and you should definitely do it. But if it turns out that the reason you're doing it is because you need a line on your resume to show that you volunteer so that you get your next job, then that's not a virtuous action. You may still have good consequences, right? But it's not virtuous because you're not doing it for the right reason. In fact, it's vicious because you're undermining your own character. Yeah. By pretending to care for other people, while in fact you're actually doing it for your own selfish reasons, you're actually undermining your character. So it's actually not only not virtuous, it's actually a vicious action. Yeah. So, and that I think it's a very important point that really gets lost in a lot of discussions about ethics in these days.
Yeah. And in terms of their character, or in terms of our character as a whole, what, according to the Stoics or according to their ancient writings, what does it tell us about why moral character was sort of exalted above all else?
Well, so we tend to talk about virtue, right, and moral character and all that sort of stuff. But the word virtue in Greek is arete. And arete just means excellence, the best you can be. Yep. Right? And so, by definition, why wouldn't you want to be the best you can be? Right. Why would you want to settle for something less than that, right? Yeah. So this is an argument actually that you find in Socrates, in particular in the Euthydemus, which is a Platonic dialogue where Socrates has to interacts with two sophists. And at some point, one of the sophists actually asked Socrates, why should I care about virtue, wisdom, and all that sort of stuff? And Socrates' answer basically is the same one that a Stoic would give you, which is well, because virtue is what actually makes everything else meaningful and good. As I just gave you the example of the person that volunteers for the soup kitchen, is like, well, it's how you do things, is why you do things that makes it valuable or not valuable. Epictetus begins right at the beginning of the discourses. There's a quote where one of his students must have asked him about money, the value of money, and Epictetus' answer is, well, sure, it's preferred, but the question is, once you have the money, what are you going to do with it? Yep. The money is not going to tell you. Your faculty of reason is going to tell you. Your ability to act virtuously. And so money is a typical example. There's nothing wrong inherent per se about money, but there is also nothing good about money per se. We tend to think in modern society that money is obviously a positive, but not necessarily. If money is in the hands of somebody who uses it in order to corrupt the political system, for instance, then that's not good. That's actually a dispreferred thing for the Stoics. It's of a negative value. Right? So that was the argument that that virtue or wisdom in general. Socrates used those two words interchangeably. And in fact, even the Stoics to some extent, because even though I just mentioned 4 virtues and we went through the differences between them, the Stoics actually subscribed to a notion called the unity of virtue, according to which the 4 virtues are really 4 aspects of the same underlying thing, and that underlying thing is wisdom, which is why the Socratic argument is essentially the same that the Stoics would put forth. So the notion, therefore, is that all the other goods, external goods, may turn out to be positive or negative depending on how you use them. And the only thing that allows you to use them correctly is, in fact, wisdom. That's why wisdom is the chief good or the only true good, according to the Stoics.
Right. And it could even, I think, be argued because I remember like when I was a kid and like, let's say, obviously kids kind of sometimes do stupid stuff. And when I would steal something, let's say, so I would actually enjoy it for maybe about a second. And then I would be clearly reminded of the fact that this thing was stolen and that I didn't earn it. So it's like in the short term, right, I might have had the pleasure of enjoying the object, whatever it was. But in the long term, because in some way I sullied my character to get it, it was something that I actually kind of hated myself for doing. So if we think about character, I even think that it's possible that kind of we have this natural tendency to just evolve toward the good or evolve toward becoming better human beings. And even if we attain those preferred indifference, I think just naturally we have a tendency to either like them or dislike them based on the motivations and how we attain them.
Oh, I agree. In fact, that sounds a little Pollyannish if you say it like that. But in fact, that was one of the main Stoic arguments. This was it was referred to as the Cradle Argument, and the Cradle Argument essentially said that look, if you actually observe human infants, human beings when they're very, very young, you will see that they're naturally pro-social. Right. They tend to do whatever is good for them, of course, for their own survival and physical integrity, etc. But they immediately realize that is interconnected with caring and paying attention to their caretakers, to the people that surround them. Right. And so for the Stoics already, that was in fact an indication that we are naturally pro-social. And pro-social is another word for virtues, essentially, because the virtue is about being pro-social. Now, in modern terms, we definitely have a lot of evidence from comparative primatology that human beings are one of the social primates, species of primates, and other species of primates, for instance, the bonobos, the pygmy chimpanzees, are also naturally pro-social. They are instinctually pro-social. Now, what the Stoics then also said is that this instinct, they didn't call it an instinct, but this is a natural, tendency, is what gets us started. But it's not enough, right? Because then at some point you hit the age of reason, which is about between 7 and 8 or 9 years old, depending development in terms of developmental psychology, and that's where you start entertaining, being able to entertain abstract concepts, generalizations and things like that. And that is reason that helps you to expand your natural pro-sociality. So you're naturally virtuous, but nature is not enough. Seneca actually says it very clearly that you start there, and then that pro-sociality has to be nurtured. First, it's nurtured inside your family, and then inside society at large. And then eventually, in fact, he actually says that at some point you might need to, in fact, reject the teachings of your family, because your parents might actually be under misguided impressions about what's really good for you. Yeah, right? True. Because most of your parents will tell you, hey, what's good for you is money, career, et cetera, material things. And at that point, Seneca says, you're now intelligent enough, developed enough that you know better. And so you need to associate yourself with what he calls a broader family. And the broader family is the family of philosophers, right? So you start reading philosophy and thinking more broadly about that problem, that situation.
Yeah. And so, a psychologist who really greatly influenced my thinking was a Stoic himself, Albert Ellis, the founder of REBT
Yes.
therapy.
Yeah.
And so, the way that Albert Ellis would conceptualize the difference between, let's say, the person's character and the sort of these preferred indifferences, he would say, look, if you're focusing on the external, right, going back to parents and going back to success and money and fame and all of these things that we can have in the world, what he says is essentially you're going to kind of seesaw in your self-esteem. Once in a while, you'll get those things. Most of the time, because of the way life works, most of us will never attain those levels of success. That's just how it is. So for us, when we kind of look at value, or the way we kind of value human nature, right, is more internal, more about us and our own kind of decision-making ability or our own sort of volition. He says we have the kind of ability to recreate our self-conceptions and base our self-esteem on something that's more internal rather than something that's literally capricious most of the time. And so why I love that is when we talk about the Stoics, there's this difference, right, between, and this is something we hope to definitely go into, this difference between, in terms of what it means, the concept of dichotomy of control, right? So there are these things that we know that we can control, and if we so choose, we can base our self-esteem on them, right? And here are all these other things which we can definitely enjoy if we want to, but we don't necessarily need them to feel good about ourselves. And so what I love about this philosophy is there's such a thing as good enough. It's like if we were to view ourselves or our lives as good enough, right, then we could look at these other things which are basically outside of our controls as just being additions or bonuses, as things that are just, they're lovely, right, and they're things that we can enjoy and they're nice to have, but if we kind of go back to the core of who we are, they don't really indicate that. They don't tell us who we are about ourselves, because we're the ones who get to choose that. And so, Massimo, I would then ask you, in terms of the dichotomy of the control, or dichotomy of control, what are the aspects of control that we can control, and what are the aspects of it that would be the preferred indifferences?
So this is very clearly laid out right at the beginning of the Enchiridion, which is Epictetus' manual for a good life. And I have to say, however, I don't particularly like the phrase dichotomy of control. I think we're stuck with it at this point. I think this was introduced by Bill Irvine, actually, in one of his early books on Stoicism, and we're kind of stuck with it. So, I'm not even going to try to change it. But I do want to point out that the word control here is a little bit misleading, because people immediately start thinking, in my experience at least, people immediately start thinking that there are some things under their control, other things are not under their control, and then there is a bunch of stuff in between because they can influence it, right? And that's, of course, true. But it doesn't undermine the dichotomy of control at all, because the things you can influence themselves are made of two components: one that you control and the other one you don't control. So you're still down to a dichotomy. But interestingly, in fact, Epictetus doesn't use the word control. Depending on the translation you look at in English, he uses the words "up to you" or "in your power." And "up to you" is actually the one that I prefer, because it gives you this image of, for certain things, the buck stops with you. You're responsible for it. And for other things, the buck doesn't stop with you. Right? So he basically makes this distinction. He says right at the beginning of the Enchiridion, said, okay, you only control the following: your judgments, your decisions to act or not to act, and your endorsed values. He doesn't use those words, but that's a pretty good translation of what he's saying there. In fact, the words that he does use often are misunderstood in English, and that's why I rephrased it. If you have to go back to the Greek to understand that he is actually being very specific there. Those things that I just mentioned actually go in parallel, go hand to hand, in hand with the three disciplines of Epictetus. The way Epictetus teaches his Stoicism, his brand of Stoicism, hinges on three disciplines: the discipline of desire and aversion, the discipline of action, and the discipline of assent. The discipline of desire and aversion teaches you to reorient your desires and your aversions. In other words, it's about your values, your endorsed values. Right? Desire here doesn't mean, oh, I desire beer, let me get up and go get it. It means, what is it that I want in life? Right? So as we were just saying earlier, most of us want success in terms of externals, and Epictetus says, no, you should reorient yourself in terms of success toward internals. Right? So your character. So what you should desire properly is a good character. That's why he's saying your endorsed values are up to you. Nobody else can force you. They can make suggestions, oh, you should really value this or that or the other, but nobody can force you. What you value is up to you, not to anybody else. Right. The second discipline is the discipline of action. And that's why Epictetus said, which is concerned with what you do with respect with other people. Right? We live in a society, so we have to figure out how to behave toward other people. That's why Epictetus says the second thing that is up to you is, in fact, your reasons to act or not to act. Right? So in any particular situation, if you act in a certain way, that you're responsible for your actions. You're the one that decided to act or not to act. In my early example in the beginning, you're the one that decides to talk to your boss or not talk to your boss on behalf of your coworker. Right? Nobody else can force you to do that. Right. They can suggest it, or maybe you should do that, or don't do that, or something like that. But ultimately, it is your decision. And then the third thing that it says is up to us is concerned with the discipline of assent. Assent means agreeing to something, right? And so it's your judgments. So what is up to you is essentially your ability to say, yeah, this is a good thing, or this is not a good thing. Right? That's and he says that's pretty much it. Nothing else is up to you. Everything else is not up to you, meaning not that you cannot do anything about it, but meaning that ultimately the buck doesn't stop with you. And he makes a list, and he gives you a partial list, and that partial list includes your body, your reputation, and your position in life, your stature in life, right? And your wealth. It's like, oh, okay, that's pretty much everything. So what does he mean by that? Well, he says, for instance, since we're having this conversation in the middle of a pandemic, right? Let's talk about the first one, health. Right. Now, in terms of health, of course, you can do certain things to improve or maintain your health, right? So I, for instance, decided a long time ago that I needed to eat, more healthy fashion, mostly vegetables, blah, blah, blah. Great, I can do that. That's up to me. That's a decision. It's an endorsed judgment, right? Health is important to me, and it is a decision. I decide what I'm going to eat or not going to eat. When I go to the grocery store, I decide what to buy, what not to buy, right?
Right.
I also decided a long time ago that I had to better go to the gym to maintain a minimum amount of physical fitness in terms of muscle tone and aerobic capacity. Again, that decision is up to me. The implied endorsed value there is my physical body requires certain kinds of sort of maintenance, basically.
Right.
And finally, I decided some time ago that preventive medicine is better than doing things after the fact. So on a regular basis, I go to the doctor, I have my analysis done, etc., etc. Great. All of this has served me fairly well. But that doesn't mean I didn't get sick over the last, 10 or 15 or 20 years since I decided to do this kind of stuff. Occasionally, a virus, as in the case of the ones that we're experiencing now, just can hit you. It can strike you. There's no fault of your own. It just happens. And it doesn't matter how much you were prepared, how healthy you eat, how often you go to the doctor, and how often you go to the gym. You're still going to get sick. Hopefully you're not going to die, but you're definitely still going to get sick. In other words, your health ultimately is not up to you. The buck doesn't stop with you. You can and should do a certain number of things to minimize the chances of getting sick, but ultimately that's not up to you.
Right.
The same goes for all the other externals that Epictetus mentions, right? So your reputation. Well, obviously the best way to preserve your reputation is to actually behave, like a decent human being. But that's no guarantee. I mean, especially these days, we live in a environment which is fraught with social media and fake news and alternative facts and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
Somebody can start a smearing campaign against you, and it can actually work. Regardless of how good a person you are, how well you acted, and all that sort of stuff, that's just going to happen.
It's true. They could take a soundbite of something that you said out of context and misinterpret it and build a whole story around it. And what you would have to do to even unwire that, the amount of work that takes is unbelievable. So yeah.
And it might still not work.
Yeah.
You may still do all that work, and people are not going to believe you necessarily. So reputation is also ultimately not up to you. Your wealth, same thing. I mean, I have my retirement account, as most teachers do, with a company called TIAA, which manages my account. Well, I haven't even looked at what has happened over the last few weeks to that account, because I know it went down significantly, and it's no fault of my own. There's no decision there that I could have possibly made to avoid that. It's just a result of external circumstances that are obviously well beyond my control. Right. And then finally, your as what Epictetus calls your office, in other words, your work, your career. There too, you can do your best, of course, and the best way to assure a good career is in fact to work hard and do the right things and all that sort of stuff. But still, I've seen, I'm an academic, and I consider myself lucky because of the position. I'm a full professor with tenure and at a good university and all that sort of stuff. But I guarantee you, I've seen in the course of my career plenty of people initially in my own cohort when I just got out of graduate school, and then even now, who are just as good as I am, or better sometimes, and they didn't get a job. They couldn't get, because of a variety of things. There's all sorts of factors that are not under your control. They're outside of your power. And, it's not like I don't think I worked hard for what I am. I did, but so did a bunch of other people.
That's true.
And those people were just as good as I am, if not, as I said, sometimes even more. And, I got lucky.
Right.
And some of those other people didn't. And that's one of the things that is refreshing, actually, about Stoicism. The constant awareness of just how large a role luck, fortune, as Seneca calls it, actually plays in your life. And that's why at the beginning of the book with Greg, the Handbook, we explain that the Stoic bet, so to speak, for happiness is not to rely on externals. Mm-hmm. Right? It's to rely only on internals. Why? Because internals are up to you.
Right.
You have the ultimate saying on those. And so if you consider yourself happy, so long as you arrive at good judgments, a good decision to act or not to act, and you endorse good values, that's it. Then you're safe, because those things are entirely up to you. But if your happiness depends on externals, such as how much money you're making or what kind of job do you have and so on and so forth, then it's up to fortune, not up to you.
It's chaotic, yeah. You'll be going with the ebb and flow of externals.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's like, and a lot of times, especially I see this with my clients a lot, they struggle with black and white thinking or all or nothing thinking, where the idea is it's either I have all of these things or I don't. And so what I've always loved about Stoicism is, again, going back to that idea of good enough, that you can have those things. Those things in themselves are wonderful, right? You can go and enjoy them. But the idea is the person that you are and the attempts that you make are always going to be the most, or at least can be the most important. And the way I kind of try to sometimes phrase it is like, let's say if you were to go up to a girl and like, for me, ask her out. And so for me and my own self, right, let's say I would still be disappointed by the fact that let's say I would be rejected, right, which happens, obviously, we're human beings. So, but what I love about that is that I can still feel proud of myself for making the attempt. So the two can coexist, that I could be disappointed that I didn't get the thing that I wanted, but on the other hand, I could be proud of myself for making the attempt. So would I have been happier if she accepted my kind of offer? Absolutely. But I could still be happy in knowing that I was sort of courageous enough to give her. What?
Also, if you don't take any action at all,
right,
you won't have any result or any experience or anything to learn from to do next time.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, and the basic notion is that we should focus on what is up to us, right? So the effort, the attempt. In other words, you internalize your goals. Did you make the best attempt at whatever the goal was? If the answer is yes, then literally you cannot blame yourself for anything, because you made the best attempt that you could. You did your best. And then develop an attitude of equanimity toward the outcomes. Realizing, as I would think adult human beings should do, that sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. Mm-hmm. Sometimes things go your way, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes fortune favors you, and sometimes it doesn't. It's the hallmark of a childish mind to think that you have to win all the time.
Right.
And of course, I know certain politicians that have that attitude, but let's not go there.
Absolutely. And say, for example, someone did have an adverse reaction to an event or something not going their way. The mental resources that you would spend reacting to that or having an emotional disturbance would take away from the very next action that you could take. Whereas opposed to if you controlled your judgment of the situation, perhaps had realized that it was out of your control, therefore you'd have not zero emotion, but perhaps little or none or no resistance. Then at that point, you have enough clarity to decide what sort of action you can take next.
Mm-hmm. Correct. Yeah, I mean, Albert Ellis would say that you need not to catastrophize.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's which unfortunately comes normal to a lot of us, because that's the way we grew up. It's like, oh, this is terrible. It's like, oh, I lost my job. This is terrible. Well, maybe it is. Or maybe it's an opportunity. Now you actually can find a different job. Maybe you were stuck there and you didn't have the guts to get out because you figured, I have a job, so I can't leave it. Well, now you're forced to leave it. So now you have, as Marcus Aurelius puts it, the obstacle becomes the way.
Right.
It's like you get an obstacle in front of you. Instead of keep banging your head on the obstacle, since it's clearly not going to yield, you go around it. You find a different path, right?
Right, and that actually happened to me. So when I worked for a private practice before this, we actually had, we called this like the Tuesday Night Massacre. So myself, unfortunately, and the nurse practitioners who worked for the practice, we were thrown off of a major insurance panel. And so a lot of us ended up, I think, lost on average 30% of our clients just overnight. And so, yeah, at the time, for everybody, this was probably the most horrific thing that could have happened to us professionally, obviously. But the thing is that this actually started the motions for me to actually start thinking about starting my own practice and opening up my own space. And if that didn't happen, as awful as it was at that period, I would have never had the courage to have done it. Of course, also with support, but by the idea that I needed something terrible or something that awful to have happened to at least got the ball rolling and to got me thinking about it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the basic notion in from the Stoics is that facts don't come with labels that tell you that they're awful or good. Right. Facts are facts, right? And then the label is up to us. Now, that doesn't mean that the label is necessarily inappropriate, right? But you have to be aware that you are attaching a label to that fact. That's one of the reasons why there's this famous bit in the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius where he tries this exercise of objectifying things, right? And it's often quoted by critics of Stoicism as an awful thing. Look at Marcus Aurelius, what a dour person he was, because in that passage he says, you have to remember that the purple that you are wearing, referring to the imperial purple, is just a tissue soaked in the blood of a mollusk, and you have to remember that wonderful meal that you had was just a dead fish, and you have to remember that wonderful Falernian wine, which was one of the most precious wines in ancient Rome, that you had is just fermented grape juice, and then you have to remember that sex is just rubbing of surfaces and an explosion of mucus. Now people look at this thing and they're like, what the hell is he talking about? This is the most unromantic thing of all, and obviously he didn't care about wine or food or sex. On the contrary, what he was doing there is he was reminding himself that he was caring too much about power, good food, good wine, and sex. I mean, after all, he did have 15 children, so we do know that he had sex. Wow. And he took a new woman after his wife died. So, although he didn't remarry, but so clearly what he was trying to do is exactly the opposite. He was basically trying to distance himself and say, okay, just remind yourself that these things that you value so much can be described in more objective terms, and those terms don't come with these labels attached to them that you care so much about. So it's an exercise in temperance. It's certainly not indicative that Marcus Aurelius didn't care about good food or sex. On the contrary, it's an indication that he realized himself that he was caring too much, and so that was his way to say, wait a minute, let's keep some distance from time to time from this thing.
No, that's smart. Yeah, it helps you to detach from the pleasures of those things. Not because those things aren't pleasurable, because if you are too attached to them, you're then a slave to those desires.
That's exactly the term that Epictetus uses. Now, the Stoics actually thought that pleasure is, as they put it, according to nature, and the pain is contrary to nature. And what they meant by this was the obvious observation that people tend to, be attracted to pleasures and tend to shy pains. There's no question about it. And so they took that on board. They said that's fine. That's why pleasure is a preferred indifferent, and pain is a dispreferred indifferent. Indifferent, of course, in the sense that they don't actually affect your moral value. Right. So experiencing pleasure doesn't make you a better person, right, or worse person. And experiencing pain doesn't make you a better person or a worse person, right? In that sense, they're indifferent. They're morally indifferent. But they are preferred or dispreferred. They are to be selected or to be avoided, right? So there is this acknowledgement that, of course, we do want all those things. But as you just pointed out, Epictetus and actually Seneca says, you are going to be a slave in proportion to the number of things you really care about, the externals that you really care about, right? The more things you care about from the outside, the more there's going to be people who are going to be in a position to withdraw them from you, and then you're going to be their slave. Yeah. If you think that a career is absolutely important to you, then anybody who's ahead of you or on top of you in that career, in the chain of work, that they have power over you. If you want money, then whoever is in a position to give you money or withdraw money from you is you're their slave. You're doing their bidding.
Right.
And that is why Epictetus says freedom, true freedom, lies not in everything, because nobody has everything,
Right.
and nobody can hold on to everything indefinitely. Mm-hmm. The true freedom is precisely not to want anything outside, other than external, other than your own goodness of character, your own ability to arrive at good decisions. That's why he's saying that's what really makes you free. Because if that's really all you care about, then nobody's going to be having any power over you.
Right. And there was a point.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there was the point that Alan made earlier, which I really liked, and I wanted to ask you about it, Massimo. So, Alan, you mentioned before that in terms of emotions, right, they can interfere with our goals. Mm-hmm. And so, Massimo, then for you, according to the Stoicism and according to the Stoics, what would be the differentiation between the healthy and the unhealthy emotions?
Yeah, so it's good thing that we brought up this issue, because, as you know, Stoics are often regarded as people who try to suppress emotions. Right. And they did nothing of the kind, for one thing, because it's not possible to suppress emotions anyway. Uh-huh. And the Stoics knew it. I mean, just read Seneca's On Anger, and he tells you don't suppress anger. You manage it. Right. You deal with it, but you don't suppress it. Mm-hmm. But you're absolutely right. Broadly speaking, they made this distinction between what they call the pathei, the negative emotions. That's the same root as pathos, pathology, so it means something bad. And the eupatheiai, which are the positive emotions. And actually, they define them very clearly. The eupatheiai, the positive emotions, are those that are in accordance with reason. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you a couple of examples in a minute. The pathological emotions, the negative emotions, are the ones that actually overtake reason, the ones that go against reason. So, for instance, anger, hatred, and fear are against reason, because when you are in the thrall of any of those emotions, you tend not to think right. They overtake your ability to think. On the other hand, love, joy, a sense of justice, those are positive emotions, because those are in accordance with reason. Mm-hmm. It's a good thing. Reason tells you it's a good thing to love people. It's a good thing to have friends. It's a good thing to fight for justice. It's a good thing to enjoy things in life, good things in life. Those are all in accordance with reason. And so the Stoic project, in terms of emotions, to some extent, can be understood as one of moving away as much as possible from the negative ones and nurturing, actively nurturing as much as possible the positive ones.
Right. Right. And it's interesting because, obviously because CBT and cognitive behavioral therapy and Stoicism are so intertwined, mm-hmm. we get the same sort of criticisms that Stoic philosophy gets. So recently there were a few Aeon articles, which I didn't really care for, even though they were very well written and the people who wrote them were super insightful. I just want to say that. But the articles were pretty much about how the main argument against cognitive behavioral therapy is that we try to eliminate emotions, which we do no such thing. So we try as best as we can to obviously mitigate their effects and mitigate them, and then we try to kind of help the person sort of manage them in a way that becomes productive, but in no way is it possible to ever suppress emotions. So it's like when people kind of look at go ahead, Massimo.
No, sorry, and that's absolutely right. But one of the things that strikes me as strange in this kind of discussion is that the Stoics are often accused of being dualists about the human mind. That's to essentially saying, there's reason over here and emotions over there, and one needs to be take control of the other. That's not the Stoic view. That's the Platonic view. Uh-huh. Plato actually famously said that the mind, he said the soul, but basically the human mind actually has three components, right? Three parts. Uh-huh. One has to do with reason, one has to do with emotions, strong emotions, and the other one has to do with appetites, as he put it, right? Uh-huh. It's the kind of stuff, the basic stuff when you get hungry, thirst and things like that. Uh-huh. And famously, Plato came up with this analogy of the charioteer that controls the wild horses. The wild horses are the emotions, mm-hmm. and the charioteer is reason. Mm-hmm. So this tripartite view of the soul, which incidentally influenced Freud. I mean, it's not by chance that Freud actually came up with also a tripartite, distinction of the human conscious and subconscious. That's Plato. That's not the Stoics. The Stoics actually thought that they were monists in philosophical terms. They actually thought that the mind is one thing. Mm-hmm. And it's precisely because it's one thing. In other words, precisely because reason and emotions are completely interconnected to each other. That is why you can use your reason to move away from the negative emotions and cultivate the positive ones. If they were distinct, there would be no way you could do that.
Right.
There would be two different compartments. And modern neuroscience, in fact, as you know, sort of backs up the Stoic intuition. Of course, the Stoics had an intuition about this stuff that didn't do experimental research in neuropsychology, obviously.
Right.
But modern neuroscience, if you read especially books like those of Antonio Damasio, who is one of the few neuroscientists who is actually conversant in philosophy, and I think it's really worth reading, it very clearly tells you that, yes, it is the case, of course, that inside the human brain there are anatomical, there are anatomical areas that are more connected with emotions, for instance, the amygdala, and other areas that are more connected with executive decision-making, the frontoparietal lobes. But the same neuroscience also tells you that those areas are massively interconnected. I mean, hundreds of millions of neurons that go back and forth between these two, which is how you can, in fact, redescribe your emotions to yourself. And you can, in fact, argue in a sense with your emotions and try to train yourself to move away from the negative ones and go to the positive. If those were not highly interconnected, it wouldn't be possible to do that. It's like, what are you going to do?
Right.
Precisely.
Yes, and also just speaking to the science itself. So when it comes to cognitive therapy and obviously Stoical practices, the idea is that we're essentially strengthening connections that were weakened by mental illness. So the idea is with mental illness, it's correlated with impulsivity, it's correlated with obviously bad decision making, it's correlated with high anxiety, high sort of stress, high sadness. And the idea is that because for a lot of those, let's say, individuals struggling with those, let's say, ailments, they don't really either have the tools or they're not feeling able to use the tools to actually strengthen those connections, strengthen the connection between the the executive part of the brain and obviously the amygdala, right, and the other part, the emotional centers of the brain. So, and the idea is that when we're talking about Stoic philosophy, by the practices, what you're essentially doing is you're making, it's like kind of what Freud said a long time ago, where he said the point of therapy is for reason to be sort of at the center of attention and to be in control. That's what Stoical philosophy is, and that's what CBT is, right?
That's right. And in a sense, I think historically, the philosophy has seen kind of a symmetrical mistakes being made, on the one by Plato, as I just mentioned. But if you go much later and you go to David Hume, one of my favorite philosophers, as it turns out, but a skeptic philosopher of the 18th century, he made the opposite mistake. He thought that the passions, as he called them, ought to be, he famously says, reason is and ought to be the slave of passions, meaning that unless you give a damn about something emotionally, you're not going to do anything. A reason by itself isn't going to give you any motivation. In a sense, he's right. Of course, we in order to do things, we need to care about things. But what he was missing is exactly, I think he made the symmetrical mistake as Plato. That is, Plato thought that, well, it's only reason. Reason ought to control things. And then Hume says, no, it's the other way around. Emotions ought to control. No, it's neither. It's an interaction between the two. A good human mind, a functioning human mind, has to be this cohesive interaction back and forth between our emotional and reasonable aspects of our mind. But there is only one mind. We don't have multiple ones. It's not a bunch of different things that sort of struggle against each other. It's one unitary thing, and we need to deal with it accordingly.
Right, and in your chapter you mentioned, I guess you put it forth as a sort of a precautionary tale of Spock. Can you tell us about that? What it would be like if you were too rational?
Right, so Spock, it's an interesting character. Right? It's, again, one of my favorite characters in science fiction, for one thing. But Spock is often presented as the quintessential Stoic, right? So stiff upper lip, suppressing emotion and all that sort of stuff. But actually, recently I had to write a paper. I was invited to write a technical paper on Spock and Stoicism. And so I went back and then sort of reconsidered the whole thing. And my impression now is that Spock is actually far more complex than this superficial cartoonish view of him often presents it. For instance, when people say that Spock is trying to suppress emotion, he himself occasionally says, especially in the original series, he occasionally says, emotions are bad and all that sort of stuff. Well, but then it turns out that he cares about justice. It turns out that he cares about friends. It turns out he cares about honor. Well, those are emotions. It's true that he puts it in terms of logic, but those are actually emotions. And of course, there is one of my favorite quotes from Spock is from one of the last movies that Leonard Nimoy did, The Undiscovered Country, where he is having a conversation with a young Vulcan woman who is, for whom he's the role model, and he surprises her by saying, logic is not the end; it's on the beginning of wisdom. Right. And it's a great quote, because the Stoics would definitely go for that, and they would say, yes, of course you want to act rationally and to think logically. I mean, when I get criticism about the Stoics along the lines of, oh, it's all about reason, there's too much reason. It's like, yeah, sure, this is a world where we have too much reason. That's our problem. It's like, what? Where do you live? So, no, I think a little bit more reason is a good idea.
Right.
But the ultimate notion is actually, as I said before, an integration of reason and emotion, because Plato and Hume both had half of the story right.
Right.
You don't want unbridled emotions without reason controlling your life, because otherwise you're behaving, as Epictetus says, as a wild beast.
Right.
And not as a human being. But at the same time, a human being who is only going after logic and completely suppresses emotion, that's a definition of psychopath.
Right.
And we don't want a bunch of psychopaths going around. And certainly the Stoics were not a bunch of psychopaths.
Right. So if we were to then conceptualize it, can we say that it's okay to listen to your emotions, and it's obviously necessary, but at the end of the day, it has to be reason that makes the final judgment?
That's right. I mean, to some extent, you can think of it this way: that your considered opinions, as Epictetus would put it, sometimes are going to go along with your emotional instinct, and sometimes they're going to override your emotional instincts, right? So, if you care about things like justice and love and friendship, then you have an alignment of your emotions and your reason. But if you if you want sex with a stranger, even though you're in a committed relationship, for instance, in fact, that's one of the examples that Epictetus brings up. Like, well, in that case, your reason might want to override that and say, yeah, I understand why you're feeling that way. She looks very attractive, but here you are. You're in a committed relationship. You love the person you are with. So what the hell are you doing?
Right.
Right. And that's kind of commonsensical. I mean, it seems to me like we don't want to be the kind of individuals that go from one emotional override to another, just going after whatever makes you feel good in the moment. I mean, that's the life of a drug addict.
Right.
If you were just pursuing pleasure in the moment, then all you do, then why not hook yourself up to a drug machine and live your life that way? Not many people will consider that kind of life a human life well lived.
Right.
So then, would you say maybe combining? I mean, the answer may be just in Stoicism itself, but what if you combined Epicureanism with Stoicism, like the reason of Stoicism with the carpe diem of Epicureanism?
Yeah, that's a good question, and this often comes up even in discussion groups devoted to Stoicism. Like, well, why can I not be a little bit of this and a little bit of that? This is sometimes referred. There's a term for that actually. It's a syncretic philosophy. Mm-hmm. So a philosophy that kind of bits and pieces from different portions. To some extent, actually, Cicero was a syncretist. Mm-hmm. Even though he thought of himself as an academic skeptic, he was also very sympathetic to Stoicism, for instance. So his writings are in fact a kind of a pick and choose of things. And Bill Irvine is actually a modern example along those lines, even though he writes mostly about Stoicism. If you read his books, there's clearly a combination of different things, one of which some element coming from Epicureanism. Sure, if that works for you, that's great. But there is a danger in syncretic philosophies, in sort of eclectic philosophizing. And that is that at some point you might lose coherence. I mean, one of the advantages of adopting a particular philosophy is that they tend to be internally coherent, internally consistent, right? So as my colleague Don Robertson, who has written a number of books on Stoicism, points out, every time that this discussion between Epicureanism and Stoicism comes up, he says, well, sure, most of the time that might work for you. But at some point, there will be a situation where you have to decide either you do the virtuous thing or you do the things that doesn't cause pain. Mm-hmm. And if you decide on the first one, you're a Stoic. If you decide on the second one, you're an Epicurean. Mm-hmm. So at some point, the two criteria will come to a head. And so most of the times you'll be fine. But at some point, if you decide, you'll have to decide, you have to take sides. Now, that said, I think Don is right. And that's why I tend to go for Stoicism as a coherent philosophy as opposed to sort of a syncretic approach. However, that said, let's not forget that Stoicism itself started out as a syncretic philosophy. Right? So Zeno took bits and pieces from a bunch of different teachers. He took bits of cynicism. He took bits of essentially skepticism. He got bits of the Eleatic school, which emphasized logic, and so on and so forth. He did not get Epicurean. He didn't really care for Epicureanism from the beginning. But Stoicism itself did start as a syncretic philosophy. However, that is one of the reasons why Diogenes Laertius, who is one of our major sources on ancient philosophy in general, not just Stoicism, in Book 7 of his Lives and Opinions of the Eminent Philosophers, which is devoted to Stoicism, he says, if it were not for Chrysippus, there would be no Stoa. Chrysippus was the third head of the Stoa, so he was a student of Zeno, and he's credited for having systematized Stoicism. Right? So cleared up a bunch of stuff, gotten rid of a bunch of stuff that didn't really work very well, and sort of applied more coherent, more strict logic, so that to make Stoicism an eternally coherent philosophy. Zeno was, so in other words, what he did was to get rid of a bunch of the syncretism that Zeno had actually studied with, because he realized that there were some things that just didn't go with each other. It's like, well, you can't argue A and B if A and B are contrary to each other or incompatible with each other. So it's interesting to me that that's what Chrysippus, one of Chrysippus' main contribution to Stoicism is precisely this idea of systematizing the philosophy.
That's fascinating. I'd never heard that before. I mean, you would think it makes sense to have a syncretic philosophy, take bits from here, and then integrate it and try to make the best version of philosophy for yourself and for others. However, that's interesting. Systematizing it provides structure, and it's a very well thought out structure. And that coherence is very, very important. That's very fascinating.
And it happened at other times. I mean, Buddhism was a reaction to Hinduism, to early Hinduism. Right. And so a lot of actually the beliefs of Buddhists are actually traceable to Hindu philosophy. However, one of the things that happened over the first 2 or 3 centuries of Buddhism is that things got purged. Right? So it started out in a certain way, and then things got systematized and purged, and you have recognizable schools of Buddhism arising over the centuries. So it's in a sense, what I'm saying is that both things are true. It is true that pretty much every philosophy begins with in a syncretic fashion, and in fact, every religion. Think about Christianity. I mean, Christianity obviously came out of Judaism, right? And in fact, Epictetus mentions the Christians in the discourses, but it refers to them as that little Jewish sect, right? At the time, they were little. He was writing at the end of the first. He actually wasn't writing. It was his student Arian who wrote these things down. But he was teaching in the end of the first century, early second century. So at the time, Christianity was in fact a small sect. But it's interesting that he didn't use the term Christians. Marcus Aurelius uses the term Christians. He's one of the first sources we know to actually refer to explicitly, philosophical sources, to refer explicitly to Christian. And he wrote after Epictetus, of course. He wrote near the end of the second century. By that time, the Christians were actually a recognizable force within the Roman Empire. Right. But for Epictetus, they were just the Jews. There was a sect within Judaism. And of course, Christianity, especially in the 4th and 5th century, after it became... took over the Roman Empire with Constantine. Then they started all these councils, right? The Council of Nicaea being the most famous. And what did they do? They purged. They took a bunch of stuff that was there in the beginning, and then they said, okay, we're going to get rid of this. We're going to get rid of that other one. We're going to rewrite this. And Christianity, as we understand it today, it's actually the result of a process of centuries of evolution, which did include the attempt to make it more internally coherent, more separate, more distinct from Judaism, and so on and so forth. So.
Right. And so returning to Stoic philosophy, I mean, a lot of what I get, like in terms of psychotherapy and in terms of dealing with my clients and cognitive behavioral therapy, is when we do focus on the internals and sort of your moral character and becoming the person that you want to be, sometimes kind of perfectionism pops up, where a person, again, black and white thinking, a person would say, oh, well, I tried to be perfect this week, or I tried to be a good person, and I just didn't work out. So now I feel even worse about myself. So not only do I not have these preferred indifferences, but now I actually feel like I have a terrible character on top of that. So in terms of kind of Stoical thinking, thinking, right? How would the Stoics sort of deal with somebody who struggles with black and white thinking and who thinks that they're either a good person or a bad person, where there's no sort of in between for them?
Well, I think that's why the Stoics told us that we're all bad persons, period. So just start from that point. They famously thought that the sage is the only person who is truly can be said to be virtuous. And Seneca tells us that sages are very rare. He says they're as rare as the phoenix, the mythological bird. And according to ancient Roman mythology, that's one every 500 years.
Wow.
So there's not that many sages around, right? Now, why would the Stoics say that everybody is not virtuous? Everybody is not, is not a sage? Precisely because of that, I think, to avoid this kind of I'm perfect. I want to be perfect kind of thing. There's no such thing as being perfect. One of the reasons the Stoics got upset with Epicurus is because he actually went around telling people that he was a sage.
Wow.
So yeah, and the Stoics said, no, what are you talking about? Nobody's a sage. So it's a goal, so to become virtuous and to become, eventually a sage is a goal. It's a reference point. But we always fall short of it by definition, by sort of right from the get-go. And so one of the things that I do appreciate about Stoicism is that it is this highly self-forgiving as well as other forgiving philosophy. Epictetus says at some point something very interesting in the discourses. He says, the beginner blames other people. The person who has made progress blames only himself. And the person who is really wise doesn't blame anybody.
Wow.
Right? So the notion being is like, no, forget blame. Forget it's both self-blame and other blame. That doesn't get you anywhere. The only thing is ask yourself every day, am I moving in the right direction? And yeah, sometimes you're going to slide back. Sure. So what? You pick up in the following day and start over.
Right.
That's okay.
And the beauty is that you're the one who has the power to forgive yourself, which is what I
Correct.
loved.
Yes, that's how Seneca explains one of the Stoic exercises, right? The evening diary or the evening meditation. Near the end of on anger, he actually gives you a pretty detailed explanation of how you're supposed to do it. And one of the things that he says there is like, it's very nice to at the end of the day to go over what you've done, to forgive yourself for things you've done wrong, to accept and appreciate the things you've done right, and then go to bed.
Right.
And it's like your conscience is clear. It's like it is in your power to forgive yourself, and then to say, tomorrow I'll do better.
Love that.
Yeah, that's it. Right? So yeah, no, perfection is a bad idea. It's really a bad idea.
Right.
What's meant by the concept everything has two handles?
That's in Epictetus, and you find it in, I think, both in the Discourse and the Enchiridion. But in Enchiridion, there's this famous phrase where he says that things have two handles. One of which, sometimes it's difficult to pick up things from one handle, and so you want to pick up from the other handle. His example is a student who apparently had a problem with his brother, and he said, my brother's been treating me badly. And Epictetus says, well, you can pick up the situation from that handle, from the point of view that your brother treated you badly. And that's going to be a tough one because you're going to disagree about what bad is. And I think he thinks he's right. You think you're right. It's not going to go anywhere. Or you can decide to pick it up from the other handle, which is that he's your brother. You grew up together and you love him. Right. So again, forgiveness. So that doesn't mean that the brother didn't necessarily do something wrong. He might have done something wrong. But the point is, you want to look at the situation from a different perspective. One is constructive. So the handle you should try to pick up the situations is a constructive angle and handle, not the antagonist one.
Right. I like that because instead of valuing a sort of short-sighted or short-term perspective of I'm angry at my brother right now, you tackle it from another perspective, from a long-term perspective, where I'm still going to be having a relationship with my brother.
That's right.
So I should tackle this a different way, where we discuss it not where I make the situation necessarily worse, but in a way where we can still have our relationship after this discourse.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it works. I mean, I actually went through exactly that situation a few years ago with one of my brothers. There was it was a disagreement between us, and of course, each one of us was absolutely convinced that we were right. And it went on for a while, and we obviously, I saw that the situation wasn't deteriorating. We were just not talking that much to each other. And so at some point, I just pick up the phone and say, hey, how are you doing? Without even talking about what the issue was. And to my surprise, although Epictetus wouldn't be surprised probably, he just acted as if nothing had happened, and our relationship resumed, and it has flourished since. Now, we haven't settled that particular issue. But the question is, well, was it that important to settle it? Right? I mean, I have my opinion. I still have the original opinion. I haven't changed my opinion. I think he was wrong on certain things. And of course, he still has his opinion. But ultimately, in the long run, it doesn't matter. Because we're still brothers, we still have a good relationship, and we're just going to be implicitly agreeing to disagree about that specific issue. Why should that specific issue, however, dominate and define our relationship as brothers?
Right.
That's what Epictetus was talking about.
Right. And then, so Massimo, one of our final questions is going to be, how do the Stoics understand what it means to be a good moral guide? And why is it that for them, judging other people is actually erroneous?
So moral guidance is something that the Stoics seek in role models, right? And so Seneca especially goes on and on and on about role models, and he's, of course, and so does Epictetus. The classic Stoic role model, of course, is Socrates. Just do whatever Socrates would do. Don't do anything that Socrates wouldn't do. Although they have others, including some mythological ones. For instance, one of the Stoic role models was Odysseus. Because Odysseus was rational, he used reason to solve problems. He was courageous. He was just, and he tried to get back to his wife and child. Basically, that was the whole point of the Odyssey, right? He turned down actually the offer of immortality twice in order to go back to his wife. So the Stoics, Seneca is very clear about this. He says, why would you want to pick a role model? He actually tells his friend Lucilius, pick a role model that works for you. If Cato the Younger, who was a pretty stern guy, works for you, great. If he's just pick somebody else who is actually more to your liking and more to. But why would you want to do that? And Seneca says explicitly, he says, because the only way to see how crooked you are is by comparing yourself with a straight ruler. Right? And so a role model is somebody you inspire to. It doesn't have to be a perfect person. It just has to be somebody who is doing the kind of things that you aspire to do. Right? But in terms of judgment, so not judging other people is, which is, in my mind at least, is one of the most welcome and also most difficult aspects of Stoicism practice, because it comes so damn natural to us to judge other people. Right. Oh, that jerk over there, that's a judgment. Right. Yeah? That jerk cut me off on the highway. You don't know. And the Stoic argument is, you have no idea why he cut you off. Right? So the first line of defense in terms of judgment is this: like, you should remind yourself that very often you actually don't have enough information about other people. Sure, it may be, the person may have cut you off on the highway because he's a jerk, or maybe because he was rushing to the hospital because his pregnant wife is giving birth to his son. Yeah. How the hell do you know? You have no idea. So, number one. So at the very least, you should suspend judgment. But the other thing is, even if you actually know for a fact that he's a jerk, because sometimes we do know that. Right. Yeah, there was no pregnant wife there. It was like, he acts that way because he's self-entitled, things like that. Sure, but that's, for the Stoic, that actually undermines his own character. The joke is on him. It's his own character is actually making, is getting worse as a result. Not yours. Nothing he's doing to you is actually gonna affect your character, and your character is the only thing is under your control, not other people's behavior. Now, whenever I say that, I have to add the obvious caveat, because people often say, "Oh, does that mean that I have to be a doormat and people walk all over me?" It's like, no, you don't. If there is an injustice going on, you should act. And the injustice, whether the injustice is against you or against somebody else, you should act to prevent injustice or to redress the injustice if it is possible. But why should you do that? And on top of that, add the judgment, oh, he's a jerk. That doesn't help. That's not a factual thing. It's a judgment, again, right? And it doesn't, the injustice itself is a factual thing. It's like, okay, this guy has actually acted this way. According to our rules, this is not a good thing to do, so I'm going to act. But why do you have to impute motives to the person? It just doesn't first of all, most of the time, as I said, you don't actually know. And second of all, even if you did know, that's not helpful. Yeah. Because that makes you into a self-righteous, vindictive, inclined to vengeance kind of person. And vengeance for the Stoics is not a good thing. Right. They have a whole Epictetus has a whole chapter in the discourses on Medea, the famous Greek tragedy, which was actually rewritten by Seneca. Seneca wrote a new version of Medea, and Medea, of course, is this famous woman who has 2 children with Jason. Jason was the guy that was the captain of the Argonauts, and Jason promises her that he's going to marry her and all that sort of stuff. And then they go back to Greece, and what does Jason do? He goes off with a Greek princess, and wants to marry her, and tells to Medea, I'm sorry, you're just a barbarian, so I can't, And obviously, Jason is not acting properly, but Medea gets so upset, so enraged that she literally loses her mind, and so she convinces herself that the way to redress this injustice is to kill her own children, who are, of course, Jason's children, right? And for the Stoics, that's exactly the problem. Jason had done an injustice, and if it's in your power to redress that injustice, you should. But if you start going down the route of rage and vengeance, you're very likely going to do something that is horrible. And it's not going to redress the injustice, and you're going to actually simply respond to an injustice with another injustice. In this case, going to the extreme of killing your own children. So the Medea story, it's a great story in Stoic lore that tells you very clearly the difference between acting rightly, acting justly, and acting under the influence of vengeance and of strong negative emotions.
Right. And that reminds me of the Marcus Aurelius quote, which I may not say verbatim, but if thou art pained by a thing, it's not that thing that is causing you suffering, it's your estimate of it. And correct. Your estimate is within your power to control, or your That's judgment right. of it. Yeah.
And Marcus himself gets it straight from Epictetus. There is a bit in Cradle where he says it is not things that upset people. It's their opinions about things.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, the implication being you can change your opinion. And of course, in psychology, as you know, this is referred to as the framing effect. Mm-hmm. Right. So, which is very powerful. There's a lot of empirical evidence about the framing effect. The notion that the very same facts will elicit very different responses depending on the way in which they're presented. Right. The classic example is if you go to the doctor and he says, "Hey, you got a 90% chance of surviving this." Right. That's one thing. If it tells you you got a 10% chance of dying, it's a completely different reaction.
Right, yeah.
But 90% survival and 10% dying is exactly the same thing.
Right.
It's telling you exactly the same factual information, but the way it's presented, it's going to elicit a very different reaction.
Right.
The Stoics basically use this framing effect as a mind trick to help yourself instead of being reacting the wrong way. And that's exactly what Marcus is telling himself. It's like, well, remind yourself that this very same situation that is upsetting you, you can decide. It's up to you to decide to think of it differently.
Right.
Instead of a tragedy or a catastrophe, think of it as a challenge, for instance, as a problem to solve, as something that can exercise your virtue, mm-hmm. and then it looks very different.
Right.
The facts are the same. And it's not it's not that you're changing. There's no magic involved here. You're not going to be able to change things the way things are, but changing the perspective that you have of things, that makes a huge difference.
Right.
And sometimes people tell me, well, that's just a mind trick. Yeah, so is life in general.
Right.
Human life is entirely a mind trick,
mm-hmm.
because we go through life by projecting certain frameworks on events.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it means to be conscious. Animals presumably don't do that. They react instinctively to events. They don't actually come up with these judgments. We do that on all the time.
Right.
And so the notion that those judgments are in fact not automatic, you can argue with them. You can say, no, wait a minute, this is not the right way to think about this. I'm going to think about it in a different way, and that's going to be more productive. That's a really powerful way to deal with life's problems.
Absolutely. Wow. And this was so fantastic. So, Alan, do you have any final questions for Massimo before we go, man?
Oh, yes. If we wanted to follow your work on social media, where can we find you?
So I'm on Twitter at M Pigliucci, Mpigliucci, and then you can find pretty much everything that I write, podcasts, videos, the whole shebang at MassimoPigliucci.com. Massimo Pigliucci, one word.
Awesome. Thank you so
Thank
much
you
for coming on, Massimo. This was excellent.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you, man. Have a good one.
You too.
Thanks, you too.
Bye.
All right. Wow.
Wow.
That was awesome.
That was like a marathon. I loved that.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Well,
All right.
guys, to everyone watching at home, if you want to follow our work, please follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and Instagram, and at Seize_podcast on Twitter.
Yep.
Like, subscribe on YouTube, click the bell.
Yes, don't forget to hit the bell.
Yes.
Yeah, and then also, guys, you can find us at the O4L Online Network, and you can find us under the Seize the Moment podcast, or STM podcast section on top of the website. Obviously, huge shout out to our guy, Vegas Media Designs. You can follow him on Instagram. And also, please, guys, don't forget, if you're ever interested in any sort of nutritional advice, you can follow, or actually, to go to the website, you can follow Vera at Verified Nutrition. That's VERAFIED. NUTRIT
ION.
Thank God. Nutrition, verifiednutrition.com. And so she prepares meals, and then obviously on top of that, she gives nutrition advice, which in terms of what Massimo said, maintaining physical health, she's a big help for that.
Also, guys, thank you so much for watching. Look forward to our episode next week, episode 50.
Oh, yeah.
And we have Scott Barry Kaufman coming on, and that's going to be really exciting. We're going to be talking about his new book, Transcend,
the new science of self-actualization, which is a build-up, or rather a building on, of Abraham Maslow's theory of, let's see how I could conceptualize it. I guess hierarchy of needs, even though Scott doesn't really
No, it's great. We'll get into
Yeah,
it next
yeah,
week,
okay.
but...
Let's just say hierarchy of needs.
But yes, look forward to that. And one last thing, at the very bottom of our description is our new Patreon link. If you like us, please help us donate. It'll improve the show, improve camera equipment, lighting, maybe a studio in the future. We'll see. But yes, look forward to next time. And again, thanks for watching.